The 2026 Solar Anomaly Report proves the sun is a machine. The sun blinked. For 43 seconds in 2026, instruments flatlined, grid clocks drifted, GPS timing stuttered, neonatal monitors jittered in unison. Air traffic control flagged phantom offsets. A hospital tech swore the ward went quiet, like the building held its breath. Then everything snapped back, 2 nanoseconds cleaner than before. Here's the part nobody briefed you on. A 195 CIA stamped Solar Anomaly Report. Fragments pried loose through FOIA, and one stubborn whistleblower labels the sun a frequency regulator with a 2026 reset tolerance. We pulled declassified slivers, lab logs, and timing records. And there's a contamination inside the file. Machine language, not astronomy. Contamination/mystery, the first leak. It started as routine physics and ended up on a desk with a blue nihil stamp that meant, bury this. Late 1950s, a Navy-funded solar study rolled through the usual stops. Spectroscopy, radiative transfer models, neutrino notes. And then someone stapled 3 pages that didn't read like science. They read like engineering. One margin carried a phrase no astrophysicist would write in the 1950s, maintenance interval. Next to it, a lattice sketch with tick marks spaced at 12 minutes, 14 seconds, 12.24, like teeth on a gear. The chain of custody looked clean. Navy lab to a RAND consultant to the agency's optics team. But when the envelope reached Langley, 3 pages were missing, cleanly razored out, the cut line squared like a drafting board mistake you can't unsee. Get this, the analyst who logged it told me he dropped his coffee when he hit the crossed out line. Artificial stellar apparatus, see SABER 1950s. He wasn't cleared for SABER, but the packet's internal code tied the study to energy security, not space science. That's the first tell. Astrophysics lives under academic covers. Energy security drags timing, grids, navigation into the room in the 1950s and beyond. The CIA already had heat from another weird file. The Adam and Eve document that blended geology with catastrophe timelines. The sort of thing offices hate because it refuses to sit in one drawer. This new solar packet felt like that. Cross-domain. Uncomfortable. A case officer penciled the same fix he used on Adam and Eve. Relabel it. He recoded anomalies as atmospheric disturbance, shrank the distribution list to 4 names, and moved the folder under a compartment you couldn't search without burning an afternoon in a vault. There was a neutrino paragraph that shouldn't have been there either, brief, careful, almost shy. It noted phase-consistent deviations that didn't match known detectors' noise at the time, and then it casually referenced a radiometer-maser hybrid, internal codename SABER, as if everyone knew what that was. Back in the 1950s, masers were bleeding-edge microwave amplifiers. Plaster one onto a radiometer, and you're hunting whispers inside noise. The footnote's tone was wrong for a footnote. Microdips are too clean for turbulence. Meanwhile, a separate insert used words like error budget and tolerance stack. That's avionics talk, not stellar convection talk. A sidebar likened solar granulation to heat sinks with active dampers. CAD language showing up where pencil and paper sun models usually lived. Whoever wrote that had a machine in mind. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A device. What nobody in that room knew yet. SABER existed, at least in memo shadow. It lived off a Bell Labs offshoot, born from wartime radar and cooled by the same pragmatism that shipped transistors in the 1950s. The first SABER test logs, according to the fragment, showed recurring microdips during quiet sun days. They recurred at stable phases, enough to tease a quantized beat. 12.24 minutes, too sharp for P-mode fuzz, like an external metronome weaving through luminosity noise. If true, that was a problem for anyone who treated the sun as a perfect furnace. A modulator plus furnace model means the light we think is free is riding a carrier we don't own. Here's where the contamination spread. The optics team brought in a RAND consultant who'd filed on grid harmonics and aerospace timing, not stars. He scrawled the line that would haunt the file for 70 years. Phase lattice, reset window. And next to a tolerance table, almost as a joke, almost as a dare, he wrote, next window, 2026. In pencil, blue grease over the year, like someone tried to smear it away. Early suppression followed the same playbook I'd later see on GPS leaks. Rename coherence ticks as thermal noise. Fold SABER under a weather sensor line item. Float an internal critique stressing selection bias. Then freeze the conversation by invoking national infrastructure risk. The analyst who logged the packet watched the circulation shrink. He watched a new cover sheet appear that emphasized flares, coronal mass ejections, the big noisy things. The small clean ticks vanished between paragraphs. But small clean ticks kept crawling out of other drawers. Air Force med officers in Hubertus Strughold's orbit, yes, that Strughold, the contested father of space medicine, were logging pilot microsleeps and circadian drifts. Decades later, the public PDFs read like sober overviews of stress and sleep. The internal notes, the ones I've only heard recited, reportedly flagged clustered microsleeps that lined up near SABER marks on odd weekends. One nurse at a stateside hospital scribbled a line that supervisors told her not to keep. Monitors sang for 3 seconds. You can throw that away as apophenia. Or you can admit it rhymes with the ticks. The CIA didn't want minds mixing with machinery either, but they saw an opening. If timing coherence left fingerprints on biology and devices, then the question wasn't just what the sun is. It was who, if anyone, manages the beat. That's when they retitled the folder with a word that doesn't belong next to sun. Regulator. The stamped subtitle in the D-class sliver is bare. Frequency Regulator, service intervals. To understand why machine language infected a solar brief, you have to go back to the instrument that made the beat visible. SABER shouldn't have existed in the late 1950s at that sensitivity. Yet its logs are the only reason a man with a blue pencil ever dared to write reset on a star. The instrument that shouldn't exist. SABER was born in a room that didn't advertise what it was doing. Not NASA. Not the Ivy Towers. A Bell Labs offshoot with radar scars on the benches and maser parts cooling in ceramic trays. On paper, it was a radiometer upgrade program. In the lab, it was a marriage of opposites. A broad, gentle ear bolted to a razor that could slice noise so thin you'd see structure nobody believed lived inside sunlight. Here's the trick they pulled. A standard solar radiometer integrates over time, smearing the chaos of granulation and convection into a clean average. You get brightness, variations, maybe P-mode wiggles if you're patient. SABER added a cryogenic front-end maser, a microwave amplifier with vanishingly low noise, and clock discipline borrowed from telemetry. The maser didn't measure light, it stabilized the timing of how you looked. With sampling windows locked to a quartz reference and cross-correlated pairs canceling common mode junk, they pushed integration into a place newspapers never write about: phase stability. On a quiet weekend, why weekends matter will come later, they ran SABER in lull mode. Long gates, narrow bandwidth, they expected slop. Instead, the trace leaned into a staircase. Microdips stepped down and back up on a schedule, so clean the technician thought the digitizer had quantized itself. 12 minutes, 14 seconds between the same edges. 12.24 minutes, recurring like a heartbeat that refused to drift. P-modes can wave that fast, but they smear, they wander. This didn't wander. It held phase the way a metronome holds a room. The first internal memo didn't call it a clock. It called it a modulation lattice riding on luminosity noise. That phrasing angered a solar physicist who'd signed on to babysit the data. The sun wasn't a radio. It wasn't allowed to carry a carrier. But the graphs didn't ask permission. Fold the time series, a line on 12.24, and the dips stacked like railroad ties. Nudge the window, the stack collapsed. Put it back, the ties rebuilt. That's not turbulence. That's a template. Why does a template matter? Because templates imply error budgets. If something repeats with that discipline, you can assign tolerances to it. And once you assign tolerances, you can ask what happens when it slips. One SABER memo framed the stakes in the plain math of power and clocks. If discretized structure rides the output, then any system using the sun as a reference, directly through photosensors or indirectly through timing ecosystems, might be phase-coupled. Climate models assume smooth forcing. Timekeeping assumes local independence. A hidden dependency can yank both. Then a red stamp showed up, nihil. Not a science review. An interagency custody mark. The gearhead who wrote modulator plus furnace watched the inbox fill with questions that didn't belong to astronomy. Who has access to the raw? How long has the beat been stable? What's the next drift? And the quiet one, can you turn it off? Interagency tug-of-war followed. One side wanted SABER boxed as weather research, harmless, routine, budgetable. The other side wanted it under energy security with clearance strings you couldn't cut. The email thread, later sanitized, reads like a custody battle over a child nobody will admit they share. For 2 months, SABER's cabinet lived behind both doors. Lab coats by day, vault logs by night. Meanwhile, the hardware kept doing the one thing that unsettled everyone. It found echoes. Harmonics at half and quarter intervals, sidebands that looked like a narrow carrier bleeding into broader light. The carrier metaphor stuck. Because engineers needed a word that made sense of the math. The astrophysicist kept circling, not a radio in the margins, and then he wrote a sentence he later tried to cross out. If it's a resonator, the plasma is the cavity. He wasn't alone. A second team did a control. They turned SABER at a calibration lamp with injected noise. No staircase. They pointed at a star of similar class to the Sun, different line of sight. No staircase at 12.24, though there were fainter structures at unfriendly numbers. When they swung back to the Sun, the steps returned like an old habit. That's when the term phase lattice moved from margin graffiti to heading font. Get this, during one weekend lull, a maintenance blackout cut local electromagnetic clutter around the lab. The 12.24 locked tighter. Jitter shrank. The analyst logged the shrink and scribbled weekend effect, with a frown. It wasn't the city dialing down that made the sun cleaner. It was the instrument's ability to hear better when the room got quiet. But that quiet revealed something uglier. A tick riding the baseline, so faint you'd miss it unless your discipline matched the mazer's calm. A narrow now that arrived like a tap on a desk. SABER shouldn't have been able to hear that in the late 1950s. The components were temperamental, the cryo chain cracked if you looked at it wrong, the digitizers wandered. But cross-correlation is a cheat code when you know how to play it. 2 ears, 1 beat, subtract the common weather, hear the scaffold. The last page of the surviving logbook carries the memo nobody wanted to own. Sun exhibits phase-stable micro-dips at 12.24 minutes plus or minus small. Harmonics present. Interpretation. Resonant lattice superposed on thermal output. Action. Sequester raw. Escalate to energy/timing. And then, in pencil softer than the rest, reset behavior uncharacterized. Next window unknown. Except a second pencil, blue and bolder, wrote the number we already saw scratched into a CIA table. 2026. The human clock drift files. While SABER was teaching instruments to hear the lattice, something quieter was happening in rooms where people tried to stay awake. The Air Force had a problem that didn't look like cosmology. Pilots nodding off for blinks of time that didn't map to fatigue models. Microsleeps, those knife-edge dips where awareness vanishes for a heartbeat, were cropping up in clusters. The logs that trickled through Strughold-era space medicine labs read like maintenance notes for mines. Onset times, durations, recovery curves, all in columns that looked painfully neat. Strughold's name sits on public histories as the architect of early space medicine. The sanitized PDFs talk about hypoxia, centrifuges, and circadian rhythms under artificial light. But the handwritten annexes, if you believe the med tech who kept duplicates for years in a shoebox, pin microsleep clusters to timestamps that later matched SABER's beat. Weekend overnights were weirdest. Pilots on sim duty, same caffeine schedules, same ambient noise, but 3-second dropouts began stacking around a repeating mark. They weren't tired enough to justify the pattern. They were synchronized enough to make it suspicious. Here's a human moment from those pages. A nurse on a neonatal night shift wrote, "The ward went in tune for 3 seconds," and drew a thin line between 2 heart rate peaks on a strip. She called it singing because all the monitors rose and fell together, just once, as if a conductor tapped a baton and the room obeyed. Supervisors told her to stop annotating with metaphors. She switched to hash marks and times. The times drifted a hair each day, then corrected back like something outside the hospital corrected them. Miners working a kilometer under rock, far from sunlight, were part of a separate study on mood and circadian drift. Their dream onset times, tracked with crude EEG rigs and a stubborn grad student, bunched in waves that didn't care about shift rotations. No windows, no dawn cues, and yet clusters hit with a spacing that later looked a lot like 12.24-minute subharmonics. You can blame the facility's generators, the hum of machinery in the dark. Except on maintenance Sundays, when the hum dimmed, the bunching sharpened. Space medicine in those years was obsessed with Zeitgebers, external time givers, that anchor our body clocks. Light is king in that world. Food timing helps. Social cues matter. But the Strughold files float an unprintable heresy between the lines. There might be a metronome you can't turn off with curtains. A beat that rides everything, light included, and nudges biology into micro-agreements it doesn't admit making. The lab notes don't say Sunday. They're too careful. They say coherence. They say entrainment. They plot microsleep probability against a rolling phase estimate drawn from an unnamed reference. Later, when SABER's folded trace spread among the very few with the right badges, a couple of doctors did the obvious thing you'd expect. A conspirator to do and a scientist to fear. They overlaid the curves. The bumps met the ties. Not every time, not perfectly, but enough to make the scalp prickle. Enough to make someone write hazard during gap nights in a margin and circle it twice. Meanwhile, Air Force docs ran jet lag trials that look pedestrian now. Shift your light, dose melatonin, watch the circadian phase advance or delay. Buried in those datasets are outliers where participants snapped to new sleep onset times and steps, not smooth curves. The steps often landed near the same rolling reference that tracked SABER's phase. One memo tried to rescue the model: intermittent schedule adherence. Another admitted, external pacer unknown. There's a thread that ties systems together when you look for it. Hospital ventilators spike and sink a few nights a year. A psychiatric ward reports an uptick in brief disorientation events, the kind that don't meet any diagnostic threshold, clustering within an hour of each other on what staff call quiet nights. Sleep labs note REM latency compressions arriving like buses, not like fog. You can drown in anecdotes if you want to, or you can line them up against a clock you were told doesn't exist. Get this, the medic we call C, a coordinator who survived 3 budget cycles by saying as little as possible, told me about a run during a solar minimum when their lab collected the cleanest sleep data they'd ever seen. Less noise in the EEG baselines, fewer movement artifacts, and a weirdly consistent microarousal pattern that repeated every 12 minutes or so, with a bigger swell every hour. They thought it was building HVAC at first. Facilities swore nothing had changed. Later, when C saw a SABER foldout at a conference where it definitely didn't belong, the hairs on her arms stood up. The ticks were cousins. The stakes write themselves if any of this holds. If biology locks to an external metronome, even in the corners it denies, then whoever understands the beat can forecast human tempo better than anyone else. Shift staffing, triage nights, flight plans, sedation windows, even the timing of high-stakes operations, medical and military, lean on assumptions about independent clocks. Slip the beat, and you tug everything softly but everywhere. Hold the beat, and you can predict when a mind is most likely to waver or a heart is most likely to sink. Of course, the cover language stayed tidy. Operational fatigue, circadian misalignment, equipment harmonics. But buried in a debrief stamped with the same energy security code that shadowed SABER is a line that doesn't blink. Human microsleep clustering exhibits phase coupling to external coherence referenced. Mitigate via scheduling buffers during predicted carrier gaps. Carrier. Not light. Not noise. Carrier. That word doesn't wander into medicine by accident. By then, whispers said remote viewers were being pointed at the sun's center, and satellites were catching a tick nobody wanted to name. But before minds and machines converged, the bodies told the secret first. They moved to a time they didn't set. They drifted together, then snapped back, as if some room-sized metronome tapped out a measure and reset the bar. The machine language in a star report. When the folder resurfaced in fragments, the first thing that jumped wasn't a diagram. It was the verbs. Astronomers infer, estimate, model. These pages specify, tolerate, budget. The syntax walked like a design review. Paragraphs ended in deliverables, acceptable drift, phase error allowance, revision notes. In the margin beside a plot of solar granulation, someone wrote heat sinks, then added active feedback dampers, as if convection cells were fins on a chassis. No one writes that way about a ball of plasma, unless they think it's behaving like hardware. A sidebar broke the taboo out loud. Phase lattice. Under it, a bullet list you'd expect from avionics, not helioseismology, node spacing, coherence length, fault containment. Another line carried a phrase that never belonged in a telescope log: error budget. That term lives in systems where you count every leak in stability, thermal, electronic, timing, and decide what you can spend before a function fails. Apply it to sunlight, and you're saying there's a function to protect beyond fusion. Then there was the table. 2 columns, one labeled tolerances, the other labeled service intervals. It paired numeric drift bands with dates. The rightmost row had a grease pencil arrow and a smeared year that still reads as 2026 if you know the number you're hunting. Above the table, a note in a different hand, Reset window. Not solar minimum. Not aphelion effects. Reset. That's a word you use when a system reindexes to keep working. The linguistic audit. Yeah, someone did one, only sharpen the creep. A contractor ran cosine similarity against a corpus of 1950s engineering memos and astronomy journals. The STAR report's machine pages, clustered with guidance documents and power supply specs. The cadence matched meeting notes from radar labs. Even the punctuation gave it away. Short, clipped sentences, parentheses with tolerances, no metaphors, all guardrails, and then a phrase that looked like a mistake until it kept reappearing. Tolerance stack. That's manufacturing talk for what happens when small allowed errors add up across a chain and push you out of spec. In this file, tolerance stack lived next to Mercury plane node, as if the writers were tracking how orbital alignments stressed a scaffold's phase. To sell that you need a scaffold. The drawing tried. It wasn't a solid Dyson fantasy. It looked like a standing wave diagram, plasma acting as resonator, nodes as quasi-stable tuning pegs. No bolts, no beams. A field condition you can excite and steer. Get this, someone circled service corridor phonon bleed twice and underlined it. Phonons are vibrations in solids. They don't belong in a star unless you're borrowing the word as shorthand for energy leaking out of a structured medium. The D-class copy blacked that line, but you can still see the hooks of the letters peeking from under redaction. Whoever wrote it was mapping pathways, not just pointing at pretty granules. A second page compared SABER's folded trace to what it called the carrier. Carrier rides luminosity noise, narrowband, phase stable, visible in harmonic sidebands. That's radio language smuggled into sunlight. The authors hedged with a footnote. Terminology chosen for analytic clarity. Translation. We know this looks like a radio, don't yell. But once you call something a carrier, you invite the rest: modulation, nodes, resets, error budgets, service. Machines. There's a paragraph that bites harder the second time you read it. Design system implies governance. Maintenance intervals require oversight. Failure modes necessitate contingency. No source. No initials. Just statements stacked like policy bullets. Next to it, a small stamp: energy security. Not national security. Not science liaison. Energy, where grid frequency and timekeeping live. Slide a cosmic carrier under that stamp, and you've admitted that timing is infrastructure. Meanwhile, the neutrino insert, brief and careful, logged phase-consistent deviations. Nobody in the 1950s could have shouted about in public because detectors weren't there yet. It's couched as anomaly tracking, but the tense betrays confidence. Deviations persist across integration windows. Persist, not appear. You don't use that word unless you think you're seeing a pattern survive noise. In the margin, SABER corroborates microdip phase. Cross-domain alignment is the one thing bureaucracies accidentally respect. What nobody outside the compartment knew was that this machine language had a cousin in another CIA drawer. The Adam and Eve document got mocked for catastrophism, but its internal style mixed geophysics with operations. Timelines. Intervals. It treated Earth like a system subject to cycles you could inventory. When the solar brief adopted service intervals and reset tolerance, it echoed that cadence. Same culture. Same need to turn uncertainty into a maintenance schedule. Stakes spill out from the vocabulary. If you treat the sun as modulator plus furnace, you're not replacing physics. You're admitting another layer that rides physics. That means intent exists somewhere, even if it's just nature's weirdest emergent controller. Intent implies governance. Governance implies interfaces. Interfaces are where failure lives. And failure modes were listed cold as checklists. Coherence loss short, node slip, localized perturbation, carrier fade, global timing jitter. Two of those map to what we saw in 2026. A 43-second flatline, then a snap back a hair cleaner, like a buffer flushed and a clock disciplined. A blue pencil memo near the back tried to pull the teeth. Reframe as atmospheric path interference. Another doubled down. Do not brief NASA, compartmentalize under energy security, treat as infrastructure. That line becomes a thesis when you lay it across decades of satellite behavior and hospital nights. If this is infrastructure, you don't argue it in journals. You patch it in firmware. You teach grid operators to clamp frequencies on quiet weekends. You tell sleep labs to expect surge nights without saying why. By the time Project Stargate alumni got their strange tasking, the machine verbs already own the file. They didn't replace astronomy. They routed around it. The sun didn't stop being a star. It gained a job description, regulator, with a reset window. The Stargate cross budget, someone thought. While the machine verbs spread through the file, another office across town opened a drawer nobody likes to admit exists. The tasking was short. Target the sun's center under blind protocols. No code names, no flourish. Just coordinates wrapped in random decoys. Sealed envelopes shuffled so hard even the handler wouldn't know which was which until after the ink dried. Project Stargate had been mothballed on paper. Off paper, a few alumni still got calls. Here's how they did it when they wanted to cut theatrics. The viewer gets a number that means nothing. No sun, no star. Just a target reference. The monitor sits beside them, poker-faced, prompts with neutral verbs. Describe. Sketch. Texture. Temperature. Movement. The room hums with white noise that smells like an old air filter. A polygraph doesn't run here. They learned it's a show. Instead, they set traps only consistency can spring. The first session came back with words that don't fit a simple fusion model. Humming scaffold, the viewer said, pausing on scaffold like it felt too solid and too thin at once. Then grid, then cool shapes. Cool where hot should live. Not cold. Cool compared to the inferno. The monitor asked for geometry. The sketch wasn't a sphere inside a sphere. It was a network, a trellis laid along planes, thicker in one band. The line labeled plane. Got a mark where Mercury would live if you'd smuggled an ephemeris into the session. They didn't. Another viewer on a different day, with a different number, landed on similar terrain. Regular. Repeats. Like music, but slow. The pen tapped a beat on the paper, 3 times, spacing even. The monitor interrupted the rhythm before entrainment turned the session into self-echo. The drawing angled a node along a thin ring the viewer kept calling a track. He wrote maintenance node, without being asked to label anything. Afterwards, in the bullpen, the handler threw up a hand. You never feed a term like that. But the page already had it. To keep themselves honest, they did what they called zero-knowledge prompts. Targets were assembled by a separate office, shuffled with decoys, barns, bridges, and abandoned radar hill, so any leakage would smear. Post-session, the analysts matched blind descriptors to blind envelopes. Only then did anyone open the key. The sun targets scored higher than chance. Not crisp enough to publish. Too crisp to ignore. Consistency is the only currency in that house. Across sessions, you look for motifs that survive noise. Humming came up more than any of them liked. Grid landed on at least 4 transcripts. Cool shapes showed twice, which would be cute if the SABER folks hadn't already whispered about nodes that behaved like tuning pegs, quasi-stable and not molten through and through. One viewer kept drawing a corridor, thin, linear, with arrows showing what he called bleed. The term would have been nonsense until someone remembered the machine page that had phone on bleed circled. They didn't show him that page. He'd never seen the file. Get this, the one sketch that bothered the case officer the most had a small notation off to the side, aligned with messenger. The viewer later said he meant a small planet, the quick one, his childhood name for it. Mercury. He'd guessed. Or he'd felt a line that SABER's folds and an engineering table had already quietly honored. Either way, the ink was there. Maintenance node, Mercury plane. You can throw remote viewing at anything if you want to make a mess. They try to keep this clean. Blind taskings, separated staff, consistency checks. They even ran polygraph-adjacent protocols once, heart rate, skin conductance, not for truth, but to catch sessions that smelled like performance. The cleanest data came when viewers got bored and clinical. No angels, no prophecies, just geometry and rhythm. Then the margin note that nobody in an astronomy liaison office wants to read. Don't brief NASA, compartmentalize under energy security, treat as infrastructure. That's not a reaction to psychic drawings. That's a reaction to the collision those drawings hinted at. If you've got a lattice in one file and a grid in another, and a timing carrier threading through both, you stop telling rocket scientists they own the sky. You start telling grid operators to harden firmware. There's a moment, quiet and ugly, when minds and machines whisper the same word. Scaffold. The SABER team used lattice because it kept the conversation in math. The viewers used grid because it's what you draw when you feel repetition. ESA thermal panel logs would later show sub-second oscillations at harmonics that mock anyone who calls this a fairy tale. But in this chapter, the evidence wasn't hardware. It was humans pointing blind into heat and sketching cool shapes. A senior analyst wrote a sentence he probably still regrets. Cognitive probes corroborate mechanical inference. He meant the pictures rhyme. He also meant keep them apart. Mixing them makes courtrooms laugh and oversight sharpen knives. So they sealed the sketches, tallied the motifs, and tucked the folder under the same stamp that dog-eared everything else with a beat. Energy security. From their perspective, this wasn't about proving anything to you. It was about cross-threading risk. If there is a humming scaffold at the sun's heart, field, resonant, call it what keeps you from throwing the file away. And if nodes align with orbital planes like Mercury's, then maintenance is a real word. Windows exist. Resets happen. And if resets happen, you manage them. Not with telescopes first. With clocks, firmware, hospitals, and flight schedules. While those drawings dried in a vault, space hardware began behaving like it heard the same tap. GPS clocks started agreeing in ways their specs said they shouldn't. A SIGINT station logged a narrow tick they labeled artifact because nobody wanted to write carrier. And an engineer in a clean room watched two clocks phantom sync during a quiet Sunday and kept his mouth shut until years later. The grid was everywhere now, on paper, in orbits, and according to a few bored clinical minds, at the core of the thing that blinked. Satellites that heard the beat. While those sketches dried in a vault, orbit turned into a laboratory nobody could shut off. The 1990s GPS constellation lived and died by nanoseconds. Every satellite carried atomic clocks that drifted like all clocks do, slow, predictable, correctable. The ground uploaded steering terms, the fleet stayed in formation, and civilians saw blue dots land on sidewalks. But in the quiet stretches of sun weather, timing corrections began clustering in a way that bothered the flight dynamics guys. Small trims bunched like fish schooling. The timestamps lined up too neatly with a fold you weren't supposed to know existed. SABER's 12.24 rhythm. A contractor inside the timing cell, Engineer B in our notes, said the pattern only showed itself when everything else calmed down. Low ionospheric noise. Stable temperatures. No software rollovers. Then, during windows that looked boring on space weather dashboards, the steering solutions would want the same sign and amplitude across birds that shouldn't share a bias that cleanly. He didn't say carrier. He said, they snapped to a cleaner beat. His boss told him to widen the residual filters and stop storytelling. Unknown to them, a SIGINT site in the 1990s had a different problem they solved with a label. Their receivers caught a narrowband tick riding the thermal background, a pulse that arrived with a spacing that mocked randomness. They stamped it artifact, filed a maintenance ticket that went nowhere, and learned to ignore it on days when the sun refused to act up. The operator who first flagged it circled harmonics in the spectrum like a kid tracing constellations. Each time, the tick came back near where SABER's sidebands would live if a narrow timing line bled into light. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, ESA thermal panel logs told an awkward story. Solar arrays and radiators sing when structures warm and cool. It's normal. But on certain quiet orbits, sub-second oscillations showed up in telemetry at frequencies that weren't tied to eclipses or maneuvers. They sat on harmonics of that same stubborn base. Engineers chased mounting bolts, foam cores, and pointing jitter. The oscillations didn't care. They arrived with a beat that would have made better sense if you'd drawn a metronome in the margin of the thermal model. Get this, one cleanroom microstory almost didn't leave the room. Two redundant clocks on a bus that wasn't talking to the ground agreed beyond spec for an hour. Not drifted together, agreed tighter than their noise budgets should allow, without a common disciplining source. The log called it phantom sync and blamed thermal equilibration. B, years later, said the hour landed right on a stretch where SABER's fold would have put a swell. The stakes hide in the supporting math. GPS isn't just maps. It's finance timestamps, grid phaser measurements, exchange matching engines, precision agriculture, emergency dispatch. When satellites quietly snap to an external beat, the whole timing stack inherits a bias. As long as the beat is stable, nobody notices because stability is a drug. When the beat fades, carrier drop, brief coherence loss, you get a flurry of small wrongs that add up to delay, retries, and human voices asking why systems feel gummy. DoD folks tried to keep the tick in a box. They wrote a talking point, thermal noise. They pushed a software patch that smoothed steering updates so clusters looked like curves. They told contractors to widen residuals and avoid phase lock metaphors in briefings. The SIGINT label artifact grew roots. ESA filed oscillation within expected bounds, and moved on because spacecraft don't get extra budget for ghosts. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. During a handful of quiet sun days, a navigation test bed on the ground spun up a local ensemble. Atomic standards, cesiums and H-masers, all cross-compared. An intern who shouldn't have had time to do this overlaid the ensemble phase against a public solar luminosity proxy, crude but steady. He smirked at his own gall until the overlay's small bumps started landing in rhythm. He sent the plot to a mentor. The mentor replied with one line: "Don't correlate clocks to stars." What nobody wrote down in an email was a guess they were all making at the same time. The sun wasn't disciplining clocks directly. The discipline lived in the shared environment: ionosphere, photon pressure jitter, thermal breathing, that became quieter or more structured when the carrier held phase. In that quiet, timing loops converged cleaner, oscillators breathed together, and ensembles looked smarter than they were. And when the carrier dipped, 2026 handed out the demonstration. 43 seconds of weird. Grid clocks drifted a hair, GPS timing stuttered, neonatal monitors jittered together, then everything snapped back 2 nanoseconds cleaner. A firmware buffer flushed. A loop reacquired. The after-action notes did not mention the sun. They talked about leap-second lessons, oscillator aging, steering conservatism. In the margins, if you looked past the acronyms, the cadence still hummed. The same narrow now that SABER teased at the dawn of masers had tapped the desk in orbit, in clean rooms, in basements full of racks that never sleep. Finance rides that hum. Navigation does too. Guidance systems that assume independence secretly love the metronome because it forgives slop. The cover-up never needed to shout. It only had to rename. Artifact. Noise. Thermal. But the satellites heard the beat. They moved to it when it helped and stumbled when it paused. And the people closest to the logs learned a hard habit. Don't say carrier. Say stability. Then quietly plan for the next window. The 2026 reset window. They didn't call it a prophecy. They called it a tolerance. The declassified fragment is dry to the point of cruelty. Service interval, cycle 12 reset tolerance, plus or minus 90 days into 2026. No exclamation points. No doomsday. A maintenance note stapled to a star. Translation inside the compartment read like a pilot's checklist. The phase lattice will re-index. Coherence may drop briefly. A new baseline will acquire. If you'd never heard carrier before, you'd think they were talking about a software update. If you had, you checked your buffers twice. The risk table that rode under that line reads like every system, you don't want to fail learning a new dance all at once. Grid harmonics, those gentle 50-60 Hz beasts, can get persuaded by tiny timing jitters into ugly resonances. Satellite firmware rollovers, remember the Y2K hum, tend to bite when loops lose their lock. Human sleep and psych. The memo didn't use those words. It said biosync perturbations, surge potential. The dates bracketed a window. January through June looked hottest. The edge note, in a hand I've now seen on 4 different artifacts, added a casual cruelty. Pulse carrier may drop for 30 to 60 seconds. Get this, 43 seconds wasn't a guess. It was the measured anomaly that fit neatly inside that hand-sketched band. Instruments flatlined, then snapped back, 2 nanoseconds cleaner, as if the room exhaled, flushed its buffers, and found a slightly better seat. Engineers love that kind of afterglow. They also hate it, because it means something outside the loop owns the metronome your loop pretends to set. Solar cycle 25 complicated the math. On paper, human cycles count sunspots, drag turbulence into the forecast, and call the jagged peak a party. The machine page spoke a different dialect. Cycle 12 wasn't a NOAA index. It was an internal count, 12 reindexes since someone started keeping track. The numbers don't align with public solar maxima. They align with service intervals in that table, as if the scaffold keeps its own book. The overlap in 2026, peak turbulence meeting a scheduled reset, made the compliance crowd sweat. Noise makes lock harder. Resets demand lock to break and reacquire. Combined, you get gumminess. So what do you do when the sky has a maintenance window? If you're the agency, you don't brief NASA. The line is explicit. You push actions into places that like silence. Firmware, grid operations, scheduled maintenance on satellites that just happen to fall within tolerance bands. An after-hours call to exchanges about volatility bands and circuit breaker calibration around dates that don't live on any public calendar. Hospitals get guidance that looks like staffing prudence. Sleep labs are told to expect noise. No mention of lattices. No mention of carriers. Infrastructure talk only. The plan read like choreography. Grid frequency clamps around the predicted dip nights. Operators told to tighten governors, accept a hair of inefficiency to dodge resonance. Satellite teams. File innocuous notices. Planned firmware updates. Partial constellation maintenance. Temporary service degradation unlikely. Translation. Some birds will ride backup loops while the primary timing source takes a breath. Finance floors set wider guardrails on matching engines during overnight windows, wrapped in language about global conditions. If you know the phase chart, you can see the beats under the prose. Meanwhile, a thin email thread sanitized, but not shapeless, muttered about local time buffers. It's a phrase that sounds like philosophy and is really just engineering. Add hysteresis to keep loops from chasing a jitter they can't control. The fragments countermeasures list was honest in a way public documents never are. Firmware hysteresis. Local ensemble discipline. Plan blackouts as shields. That last one is ugly. Take load off at known awkward moments, so if a frequency wobble arrives, it has fewer toys to knock over. Here's the part that didn't make any slide deck. They argued about whether to comply with the metronome or buffer it. Compliance means lean in, align operations to the beat, let the reset pass cleanly, reap the post-snap calm. Buffering means assert local time hard, refuse to be pulled, risk fighting the very thing that makes your loops converge the other 364 days. One memo took a middle path, comply on backbone systems, buffer at the edges where humans touch the interface. That way, if a ward sings, it does so with extra hands on shift. You can hear the ethics rattling their cage behind the acronyms. If this is maintenance, not malice, then secrecy buys stability at the price of agency. Tell the public the sun is a machine with service windows, and you invite panic. Don't tell them, and you accept that a handful of desks time their patches to a cosmic reset nobody voted on. The fragment dodges that judgment. It writes like a firewall rule, allow stability, deny noise. To make the window survivable, they had to guess how resets feel. SABER's early logs hinted at it. A brief coherence loss, the staircase blurs, the tick fades, then a return a hair cleaner, as if nodes retied their strings with better knots. We felt that in 2026, clocks stuttered, monitors jittered, pilots filed odd incidentals, then the world found 2 nanoseconds it didn't have before. Cleanliness feels like grace until you ask who swept. There's one more line that reframes everything if you let it. A hand, not the blue grease, a finer nib wrote, post-reset baseline may shift by 010. That's engineering shorthand for tiny. But tiny in time is enormous in systems that live on time. Nanoseconds don't impress poets. They run markets and fly planes. If resets recur, then ancient records stop reading like myths and start reading like logs. Nights without wind. Days of still birds. Calendars that count more than seasons. The machine page didn't preach. It scheduled. 2026 was a tolerance band, a maintenance window printed in pencil a lifetime ago by someone who thought in lattices and carriers. We felt it for 43 seconds. The rest of the window is where choices live, compliance, buffering, silence, or the risk of telling people their daylight keeps time. Ancient calendars as service logs. To see whether resets recur, you don't start with telescopes. You start with stones and scribes. There's a reason old calendars feel mechanical when you read them without romance. They weren't just counting days. They were tracking tolerances. And if a lattice hums under sunlight, cultures living by crops and stars would hear the beat long before we built masers. Take the Maya. Everyone quotes the long count like it's a prophecy clock. Look closer at the math. It's factorized time, backtons, catoons, tons, nested cycles that interlock cleanly. Farmers don't need base, 20 elegants to plant maize. Engineers do to reduce drift. The intervals aren't random poetry. They're metronomic math, period relationships that hold phase across lifetimes. Now set the long count resets beside SABER's long periodicities. You get echoes, alignments where major calendar rollovers sit near low-frequency beats you'd expect if someone watched for coherent swells and fades. It doesn't prove intent. It puts a thumbtack through coincidence. Egypt kept a different set of pins. The Decans, 36 star groups, rose in sequence through the night, hour markers before there were hours. Priests used water clocks to calibrate them, but temple notes have odd little lines on certain nights, night without wind. It isn't meteorology the way we use it. It reads like a behavior report. Torches burn steadier. Boats along the Nile drift less. Sound carries. Those annotations cluster around spans where modern phase folds show cleaner coherence. Again, correlation isn't causation. But the pattern doesn't hate itself. Rome gave us lists of prodigies, birds falling, suns dimming, rivers still. They sound superstitious until you graph dates. Batches of still. Birds sit near solar minima alignments where the atmosphere turns glassy and soundscapes change. Zoom in and some entries fall within nights that, centuries later, would match SABER's swell windows. The imperial scribes didn't have mazers. They had markets, soldiers, omens. They wrote what broke consensus. If the metronome stumbled, or sharpened, they noticed because crowds moved wrong. Now walk out to the granite. Megalithic sightlines get dismissed as solstice toys. But a few sites carry extra notches that don't care about solstices. Thin foresights, off to the side, that only catch transits a handful of times per year when the sky's steadier. Set up a stone to frame a microinterval, and you're building a metronome out of rock. The phrase stone metronomes sounds romantic until you map the sightlines to intervals that rhyme with SABER harmonics. Local geology matters. So does craftsmanship. Still, too many pegs line up with too many beats to wave away as coincidence without at least a raised eyebrow. Here's a microstory buried in a codex margin. A scribe marks an otherwise dull date with a tiny glyph used nowhere else, a spiral over a straight line. The note says the night ran smooth. Candles didn't flicker. Babies slept. Dogs didn't bark. It's domestic, almost boring. It's also exactly what you'd expect if the carrier held phase and the world exhaled into coherence for a bar. No visions, no gods. Just a house that stopped arguing with itself for a minute. Before you accuse anyone of retrofitting myth to math, take the caution flag seriously. Correlation isn't causation. Calendars chase crops, taxes, festivals, power. Ancient weather wasn't logged like telemetry. And selection bias is a trickster. You can cherry-pick any list long enough and smack it against a modern chart until it fits. That said, engineers treat recurring near misses across independent systems as smoke that deserves a nose. The Maya weren't quoting SABER. Egyptians weren't watching sidebands. Romans weren't graphing phase lattices. But the way they wrote time looks less like storytelling and more like service logs when you read it through this lens. What nobody likes to say out loud: regular resets demand human coping. If resets were rare and catastrophic, myth would be scars only. But if Windows came as maintenance, brief coherence dips, then cleaner baselines, you'd embed tiny practices. Extra staff on certain nights. Rituals that sound pious but schedule buffers. Markets that open late on days called unlucky because the birds used to sit still. You'd bake hysteresis into culture without ever using the word. Get this. One megalithic site shows a double sight line that only aligns when Mercury hugs the dawn in a way it does a few times per year. The second line isn't for show. It frames a skinny interval that, when you simulate sky and air stability, lands on cleaner acoustic nights. Remember the viewer's sketch, maintenance node, Mercury plane. We're not proving anything with a stone and a hunch. We're admitting rhyme across centuries that didn't share a language. And here's the twist that makes scholars itch and grid operators lean forward. When modern independent experiments, like the Quiet Sun Grid Harmonic Study, documented lock-in across substations on 2 continents, their phase agreement fell on nights that, if you scrape old almanacs, sometimes were small annotations about air, sound, sleep. Ancient observation, modern telemetry, same hum beneath the ink. So no, this isn't a museum heist where we steal meaning from artifacts to dress a theory. It's a request to read ledgers like engineering, resets as intervals, decans as shift markers, long count rollovers as scheduled reindexes a civilization could ride. The myth is a mask. Underneath is a record of how people lived with a metronome they didn't own. And if they lived with it, they left us procedures disguised as festivals and warnings disguised as stories. Bridging lore and lab needs modern voices who walked the whistleblower profiles and paid for telling. They don't know each other. They never sat in the same room. But if you overlay their timelines, the beats line up like old tape marks on a studio floor. Analyst A is 80 now, and laughs like a man who's been told to forget too many times. He handled the 1950s packet the day the Nihil stamp hit. He remembers the weight of the envelope, heavy like a book, light like trouble. The cover said Solar Study. The insert didn't. The first page he turned to had avionics verbs marching down the margin. Tolerances, error budget, service interval. He'd processed the Adam and Eve file the year prior and recognized the scent, cross-domain, operational, allergic to journals. Get this, A says the phrase that made his hand shake wasn't even in a sentence. It lived in a parenthesis. Artificial stellar apparatus, see SABER. He logged the accession, stamped the routing, and went to refill his coffee. When he got back, 3 pages were gone. Not misfiled. Razored. The cut was too perfect for clumsiness. He filed an incident note that vanished before lunch. That afternoon, the label, atmospheric disturbance, replaced phase lattice. By morning, the circulation list had shrunk to 4 names, his not among them. He remembers the blue grease pencil arrow knifing toward a row in the tolerance table. Next window, 2026. He swears the pencil was still wet when he saw it. He also remembers the suppression choreography. The file moved from science liaison to energy security. NASA fell off the CC line. He watched a new briefing deck grow teeth around flares and CMEs while the small, clean ticks slipped between slides. When I asked him what broke his compliance, he shrugged. I kept the memos they told me not to keep. He opened a folder. Tolerance stack. Reset window. Mercury plane node. Same handwriting, same ink, same fear of nouns like machine. Engineer B is 57, all clipped sentences and long silences. He worked timing on the GPS constellation when quiet Sundays turned surgical. He won't say SABER unless I say it first. He will say this. During low noise windows, the fleet steering solutions bunched like someone offstage clapped. Residuals narrowed together, he told me. Across birds that shouldn't have agreed that tight without a shared disciplinarian. He wrote Phantom Sync in a lab notebook once and got a lecture about artifacts and widened filters. B's microstory sits in one paragraph he hates remembering. 2 redundant clocks on a bus that was offline agreed past spec for just under an hour. No common disciplining input, no ground uplink, just a room that felt unnaturally quiet. He ran thermal models, vibration checks, aging curves. The numbers didn't move. Years later, he overlaid that hour on a SABER fold he wasn't supposed to have. The swell matched. I don't think the sun talked to us, he said. I think the room got still because something bigger held still. Our loops like still. He forwarded me a scrubbed SIGINT memo with the word artifact underlined 3 times next to a narrow tick. He's the one who first said the sentence I haven't been able to unhear. They snap to a cleaner beat when the carrier holds. He never wrote carrier in an email. He wrote stability. When the 2026 flatline hit, he was in a lab 3 floors below ground, staring at an ensemble that hiccuped, then came back 2 nanoseconds cleaner. He didn't look at the sun. He looked at a wall clock and felt late for nothing. Medic C is 44 and sounds tired the way people do when data won't sit still unless you beg it. She coordinated a sleep lab that kept meticulous logs through 3 budget cycles, long enough to see patterns managers call anecdotes until they get sued. Her notebooks have no poetry, just times, phases, and a column she calls oddities because supervisors banned metaphors. Oddities stacked near weekends during quiet solar stretches. Microsleeps that should have smeared lined up. REM latencies compressed in steps. Neonatal monitors sang, once a month, and then twice during one winter she now knows sat under a SABER swell. C kept one off-the-record email from a collaborator at a grid harmonics study. Your curve matches an old government line we aren't allowed to cite. She didn't know what that meant until a contractor at a conference she wasn't supposed to attend showed a folded 12.24-minute trace like it was an art print. That, she said, pointing, is when the ward goes in tune. The room got quiet enough to hear the projector fan. Credibility frames matter when stories walk into vaults. A's employment timeline matches the accession logs I've seen redacted to boredom. B's contractor badges line up with GPS maintenance windows I can check against public notams and a few off-hours constellation notices. C's staffing rosters and anonymized patient counts track with hospital schedules filed to regulators. None of them handed me smoking guns. They gave me paper cuts, edges that align when you stack them. Here's the part that still gets me. 2 of them used the same phrase I'd only seen in the fragment. Tolerance stack. A said it like a confession. B said it like a problem set. It shows up next to 2026 in the machine pages. Different lives. Same vocabulary. Same beat under their days. Their risk is boring and real. I could lose a pension fight if anyone wanted to be cruel. B could watch contracts shrivel under pretext. C could be labeled unscientific by people who never read her raw. They know this. They still said carrier out loud in rooms where that word has a cost. Their voices don't prove a scaffold. They map how anomalies get filed into drawers with friendly names. Rename coherence ticks as thermal noise. Bury SABER under weather research. Seed debunker traps that dare you to step wrong. And yet, between those maneuvers, the beat leaks. Through a coffee-stained memo. Through a clock that overshot its promise. Through a ward that sang for 3 seconds and then slept. The cover-up playbook. While those 3 voices mapped the edges, the middle of the story learned how to hide in daylight. The playbook wasn't a single memo. It was a habit built over decades. Rename, refile, reroute, and if you must, release carefully. Start with the renaming. Coherence ticks became thermal noise, the way a rumor becomes weather, common, boring, and nobody's fault. If a timing trace showed bunched corrections, the language shifted to residual smoothing. If a satellite panel vibrated on a harmonic, the ticket read within thermal bounds. If SABER found a staircase at 12.24 minutes, the footnote said, instrument quantization candidate. The point wasn't to lie. It was to choose words that removed intent. Machines have intent. Noise doesn't. Then came the burial. SABER was never going to carry the weight of machine in a public budget. So it went under benign umbrellas, atmospheric optics, weather instrumentation, radiative transfer calibration. Line items spread like dandelions through academic grants. Phase stability studies called path length corrections, cross-correlation rigs labeled telemetry QA. If you went hunting, you'd see pieces of SABER everywhere and nowhere, like a cut gem scattered on concrete. The trick was diffusion. No single lab saw enough to say lattice without sounding like they'd slept badly. Agencies unified talking points early. You can tell because phrasing repeats across memos that should have had different authors. No evidence for externally disciplined coherence. Observations consistent with stochastic models. Apparent clustering attributable to analysis windowing. When a phrase copies that cleanly a committee wrote it, the committee's stamp matched the one on the machine pages. Energy security. Debunker traps were part of the choreography. Plant plausible mistakes in any leak that escaped. A mislabeled axis here, an uncorrected leap second there, a sample rate aliasing error waiting for eager hands. When someone inevitably published, the rebuttal would arrive with a surgeon's precision, cut the error, and let the rest bleed out by association. The point wasn't to correct the record. It was to make the topic radioactive for anyone with a career to lose. Meanwhile, controlled leaks pushed attention toward flares and CMEs, loud events with pretty pictures and funding gravity. Press briefings loved auroras. Forecast desks loved KP indices. Coherence ticks, by design, didn't exist in that universe. They're not mood lighting in the sky. They're a tap on a desk you can only hear if your room is quiet and your clocks are sober. Get the public to chase storms, and the maintenance window walks past like a janitor. Here's a microstory that says the quiet part out loud. A FOIA packet arrived to a small newsroom fully paginated. Table of contents, page numbers, divider sheets. Every page listed existed. None contained content. Between the covers, whiteouts as purposeful as glass. The reporter filed an appeal. Months later, a new packet came. The same, plus one fresh page that said no responsive records. The cover letter used 3 paragraphs to say, "We can't find what we already numbered." That's not incompetence. That's a message. You can count our absences. Beneath the paper tricks lived firmware. Patches rolled quietly across infrastructure during predicted awkward nights. GPS control segments smoothed uploads to blur clusters. Exchange matching engines widen volatility bands under the fiction of periodic calibration. Grid operators were told to clamp frequency and accept short-term inefficiency in low disturbance intervals, which is a bureaucratic way to say, when the sky goes still, hold your breath. The words never met the lattice. They didn't need to. The behavior did. Academia wasn't immune. A reviewer would love your coherence paper, then ask you to remove phase lock from the abstract and replace it with apparent entrainment. Another would insist you cite an old RAND path length memo that replaces carriers with environmental regularities. If you complied, your paper slid into print, stripped of nouns that would attract knives. If you didn't, it died in a polite email about scope. Unknown to many authors, seed documents did lapse through conferences. PowerPoint ghosts with key equations, correct, valuable, but framed as advanced noise modeling. Circulated just long enough to train a generation to hear the beat, but call it something else. A guidance note even suggested avoiding metaphors that suggest governance, which is the sourest way I've ever seen someone say, "Don't say machine." Sometimes the cover-up looked like generosity. A grant would arrive for quiet sun baselining, encouraging teams to collect the exact data that would show lock-in. The reporting template, however, fixed window sizes and smoothing kernels that guaranteed the staircase would smear. Publish your null. Cash your check. Train your students to miss the tap. And still, leaks happen because reality is patient. A university consortium ran the Quiet Sun experiment and documented phase lock-in across substations on 2 continents. Their off-the-record email, "Your curve matches an old government line we aren't allowed to cite," was the mask slipping. The response was classic: praise the rigor, quibble a parameter, suggest more data, and quietly fund a replication with just enough design changes to wash the phase. When independent timing labs saw ensembles breathe together on boring nights, a standards body issued a note about unexpected covariance under certain environmental stabilities and recommended local ensemble discipline. The same phrase that lives in the fragment's countermeasures. That's not denial. That's managed admission. The cover-up doesn't erase. It reframes. It teaches professionals to hear a metronome and call it weather. So why keep burying? Because once you say regulator out loud, you owe the world governance. Maintenance implies oversight. Oversight implies power. Power invites panic, lawsuits, and the kind of politics that fries systems. The playbook protects stability by rationing nouns. Call it noise. Patch in silence. Seed just enough truth for the people who must act. And when a leak scrapes daylight, point at the storm and smile. The Quiet Sun experiment, QSE. While the playbook blurred the beat, one project did the opposite. It tried to make the room as quiet as possible and listen. The Quiet Sun experiment wasn't a single lab. It was a small consortium that hated drama and loved baselines. Their pitch was boring on purpose. Study power grid harmonics during deep solar minimum to isolate environmental noise. No flares, no storms, just the grid breathing when the sky calmed down. They picked substations on 2 continents with different architectures. One a stiff, overbuilt network with heavy synchronous machines, the other lighter, inverter-rich and twitchy. If a phantom rhythm showed up in both, it wouldn't be a quirk of one country's steel. They timed their campaign to a stretch of solar cycle 24 that space weather bulletins called uneventful. The QSE folks called it a gift. Here's how they listened. Each site ran high-resolution phaser measurement units, PMUs, sampling at thousands of frames per second, phase reference to local atomic ensembles, and GPS. Then they did the part utilities rarely bother with. They locked local time hard, cross-checked against multiple references, and logged raw, unsmoothed phase angles and amplitude spectra out past where anyone writes reports. A boring month turned into terabytes of breath. They expected mush. They found a whisper that wouldn't smear. When they folded the phase data against a rolling 12.24-minute template, tiny oscillations in grid angle and frequency fell into step. Not big enough to trip protection, big enough to be real. On nights that would later line up with SABER's swell windows, lock-in sharpened. On others, the steps blurred but didn't vanish. The term they reached for wasn't mystical. It was the same one the machine pages used, phase lock. Replication made the whisper harder to wave away. The stiff grid and the twitchy grid agreed on timing, within errors too small to call coincidence. Different transformers, different controller fleets, different latitudes, same cadence hanging off the edges of the spectrum like a barely there shelf. The team chased local artifacts like zealots, HVAC cycles, wind farm dispatch quirks, pipeline pumps, even a stadium's lighting test nobody told them about. Subtract them all, and the shelf kept returning. Then came the email that changed their posture from curious to careful. Your curve matches an old government line we aren't allowed to cite, from the 1990s. Off the record, from a reviewer whose name mattered, the note confirmed what their plots suggested. They were tracing the same ghost older teams had seen and learned not to name. The consortium tightened, their methods and their mouths at the same time. Get this, one site ran an audacious control. During a predicted swell night, they temporarily disciplined a local microgrid to an ensemble that ignored GPS, then let the larger grid discipline itself normally. The microgrid's internal phase wandered just a hair off the big grid, then drifted back as if tugged by a rubber band. The timing of the tug matched the fold. Nobody wrote carrier. The lab book says, External pacer exerts weak coupling even under ensemble discipline. That sentence reads like a dare. They sent a preprint with cautious language, apparent entrainment, environmental regularities, low-frequency coherence features, and figures that, to trained eyes, were SABER's staircase in different clothes. Reviews were kind. One asked them to widen analysis windows to ensure robustness. Widen the windows, smear the steps. The revised paper sailed through with conclusions softened to near nothing, and a supplemental that quietly held the keys. Meanwhile, a backchannel lit up. A standards body circulated guidance on unexpected covariance under environmental stabilities, recommending local ensemble discipline and modest hysteresis in control loops, phrases that live in the fragment's countermeasures. A utility partner, spooked by how clean the nights looked, quietly scheduled governor tightening around the next predicted swell, then reported reduced small signal hunting. Engineers called it better tuning. The timing matched the fold. The consortium's strongest plot never made it to print. It overlaid 2 continents' PMU phase against an independently derived 12.24 template extracted from sunlight proxies and, yes, an old SABER-derived fold someone shouldn't have attached. The alignment wasn't perfect. It never is. But sections stacked like railroad ties, and the ties sharpened during deep minima the way hallway whispers carry when the building sleeps. One member pushed harder. He tried to fish for sidebands, the harmonic cousins SABER hinted at. On one quiet week, a set of weak peaks appeared at half and quarter intervals, barely above noise, then faded with daylight load changes. If you're superstitious, you call it the scaffold singing. If you're careful, you call it suggestive and ask for more time you'll never get. Here's the quiet victory. Replication didn't just hold across continents. It held across architectures, weather, and operators who didn't compare notes until after the fact. That's how you know you're not faking it with your own expectations. Different rooms, same tap on the desk, louder when the world is still. The stakes for QSE were small in the news and huge in practice. If independents can see the tick with public gear and patient math, the machine claim stops being a rumor and becomes testable. That terrifies gatekeepers and comforts engineers. Terrifies because governance questions follow data like storms follow heat. Comforts because once you see the beat, you can plan around it, buffer here, comply there, staff nights that sing. They never wrote, the sun is a machine. They wrote, observed low-frequency phase coherence suggests external pacing under quiet sky conditions. Then they packed their gear, filed their code, and watched their inboxes fill with friendly notes that all said the same thing without saying it. You found the line we were taught to step around. Architecture, lattice, nodes, carrier. To make sense of all the scattered whispers, the staircase, the ward that sang, the clocks that phantom synced, you need a model that doesn't insult physics and doesn't require bolts in space. The working architecture lives in 3 words the machine pages pinned together without apology: lattice, nodes, carrier. Start with the lattice. Don't picture a cage. Picture a standing wave pattern living inside plasma, the way sound can sculpt sand on a vibrating plate. In a star, convection, magnetism, and fusion noise are the chaos. On top of that, SABER kept catching something that behaved like order. Phase-stable micro-dips at 12.24 minutes with harmonics stacked neat. A lattice is the least wrong way to talk about a resonant scaffold that emerges when a volume supports discrete modes that reinforce one another. The phrase, if it's a resonator, the plasma is the cavity, wasn't poetry. It was an admission. The furnace doesn't go away. The furnace becomes the medium. Here's where the language fight matters. Call it a resonator, and you're still inside physics. Call it a controller, and you've crossed into governance. The file walked the edge. Phase lattice stayed in math. Reset tolerance and service interval shoved it toward purpose. The lattice is the stage where purpose could act. Now the nodes. SABER's harmonics and the viewer's sketches both leaned on points where structure thickened. Tuning pegs in a violin that isn't solid wood, but a field in a fire. In a standing wave system, certain locations carry stable phase relationships, longer than their neighbors. Quasi-stable, not permanent, good enough to anchor alignment. The page that referenced a Mercury plane node wasn't naming hardware. It was pointing at a symmetry plane where periodic gravitational, magnetic, and rotational conditions line up often enough to help the scaffold hold a straight face. Get this, the Mercury angle isn't mysticism. It's cadence. The innermost planet laps the sun fast, dragging small but regular perturbations through the inner heliosphere. If a resonant pattern wants periodic nudges to maintain registry, a fast, faithful timekeeper on a recurring plane is useful. Remote viewers called it a track. The memo called it a node. SABER treated it like a metronome mark when folds sharpened around certain alignments. Different methods, same rhyme. Nodes don't mean bars you can walk on. They mean conditions where phase is easier to keep. Think of a stadium full of clapping hands. If a few sections anchor the beat, the whole place can hold timing longer, even with noise. Move those anchors or let them drift, and the pattern smears. When a node slip shows up as a failure mode in the file, it reads like a section losing the beat. Localized chaos, recoverable if the rest keeps time. Now the carrier. This is the part that turned astronomers into engineers against their will. SABER's sidebands, the SIGINT tick, the way GPS residuals bunched on boring days. All of it points to a narrowband timing feature, riding the sun's broadband luminosity. Not a radio broadcast you can demod with a kitchen coil. A coherence line, a repeating now, that modulates the envelope of noisy output just enough that phase-aware systems can hear it. Carrier rides luminosity noise, is ugly English and clean engineering. It says the signal isn't separate from the light. It lives as structure in the light. Why would that exist? The file's ugliest, quietest answer sits in the sealed paragraph we'll get to later, but the scaffolding is already here. A biosphere and a technological civilization both thrive on shared time. The Earth's rotation gives a day. Orbits give seasons. But neither provides sub-hour coherence that stitches clocks, hearts, and loops together when the environment goes still. A carrier that gently disciplines phase across scales. Ionospheric delay, thermal breathing, oscillator wander. Turns the world into a room that can agree on beats it didn't negotiate. Maintenance is where the architecture stops being a diagram and starts being a schedule. Resets are reindexes. The lattice lets go, reties, and acquires a new baseline. Pulse carrier may drop for 30 to 60 seconds, is the operational face of that physics. You feel it as 43 seconds of gummy systems, then a snap to a slightly cleaner phase. The pencil line post-reset baseline may shift by 0.10. Says the room found a better chair by a nanosecond. That's the kind of difference an exchange will never tweet about and a flight computer will quietly love. Failure modes read like what you'd expect if the architecture isn't fiction. Soft fail, lattice, Earth rotation desync, small timing storms, leap second deja vu without the leap. Hard fail, node slip, local weather weirdness, jet stream hiccups, crop timing off by days in a region that swears nothing changed. The file doesn't promise apocalypse because it thinks in control theory. Perturb, reacquire, continue. The crisis is coordination, not fire. Purpose is the word everyone wants, and the file only edges. Regulate terrestrial time rate, biosync, and technological synchronization is how one sanitized paragraph summarizes 1,000 marginalia. If that's right, then the sun isn't a machine bolted onto nature. It's a star whose natural resonances have been coaxed into an infrastructure function. Modulator plus furnace. So the living and the built can share a metronome too fine for dawn and dusk to deliver. There's one more piece that lives between lines. Interfaces. If a lattice disciplines phase, systems can choose to comply or buffer. Firmware hysteresis, local ensembles, governor clamps. Those are human interfaces to a skyborne controller we don't steer. The architecture sets the hallway's echo. We decide if we march or wear soft shoes. So the map is spare and stubborn. Lattice, standing wave scaffold in plasma. Nodes, quasi-stable tuning pegs, Mercury's plane among them. Carrier, a narrow coherence line living in noisy light, audible to anything with phase discipline. Maintenance, resets that drop, retie, and return cleaner. Purpose, shared time across biology and machines. Call it machine if you need the failure modes and
Just
crisis
don't forget the
scenarios.
furnace.
Here's where the architecture stops being elegant and starts costing sleep. If a lattice really disciplines phase, then failure isn't fire and ash, it's timing that goes crooked. Soft fail first. The scaffold slips half a step against Earth's rotation. You don't see flames. You see leap second deja vu, without the leap. Network time servers chase each other. Clocks in different buildings argue by microseconds that bloom into seconds when software retries stack. GPS fixes smear by a few meters, then snap, then smear again. Air traffic controllers hear lag in voice relays they can't measure, but can feel. The world keeps its lights on and loses its rhythm. Soft fail looks petty until it stacks. Grid control rooms watch frequency, do a slow wobble that doesn't trip protection, but makes governors hunt. Phaser angles breathe in unison on nights that used to be easy. Satellite attitude loops ring a little because thermal breathing doesn't damp quite right when the carrier's grip loosens. Market-matching engines reply a hair late, then compensate, then overshoot, like a drummer trying to catch the click track without admitting the click dropped for a bar. Nobody files apocalypse. Everyone files anomalous latency. Hard fail is rarer and uglier. A node slip, one of those quasi-stable pegs that anchors phase, drifts far enough that local coherence loses its crutch. Weather doesn't explode. It gets weird where you live. Jet streams develop kinks that stall longer than the models like. A planting season in one region arrives on calendar and misses biology by days. Migration paths wobble. You see crop cycles skew not everywhere, not forever, but in bands that feel like somebody dragged a finger through wet paint. Instruments behave. People notice because bodies and supply chains don't enjoy syncopation. Here's how a human day bends when the beat drops. Sleep fragments. Not insomnia, shallow sleep that breaks in clusters. YARs report upticks in brief disorientation, panic spikes that don't add to full-blown psychosis but fill waiting rooms. Anesthesiologists whisper about induction windows feeling slippery. Pilots on long hauls file more momentary lapses in the logbook language that hides fear. Neonatal wards hum a chorus and then go too quiet. None of it fits a headline. All of it fits a histogram plotted against a carrier that took a breath. Infrastructure stumbles like it learned to walk yesterday. HV transformers flirt with resonance as small timing errors beat with mechanical modes they usually ignore. Protection relays trip a hair more often on nuisance events because the angle at which they judge fault versus flow shifts faster than their designers expected. In orbit, safe mode cascades become a phrase. One satellite drops into protection. Its neighbor reconfigures to cover and hits a thermal edge case. Then two birds down means a ground segment scrambles and uploads too carefully, which delays reacquisition. None of it is doom. All of it is cost. Control rooms respond the way cautious people do when a metronome misbehaves. Firmware hysteresis goes up. Don't chase short wiggles. Local ensemble discipline tightens. Trust your cesiums first, GPS second. Exchanges widen volatility bands and set circuit breakers a notch kinder during predicted guminess, wrapped in language about seasonal conditions. Hospital staff surge nights quietly. Airlines pad block times. It looks like prudence. It is. It's also a confession that the beat they don't name matters. Now the ugly corner, attacks love fog. A soft fail window is a thief's alley for cyber crews who live to time payloads against the world's reflexes. Inject a carefully phased disturbance into a grid when governors hunt, and you get more for your what than you deserve. Spoof a handful of GPS receivers when ensembles are already arguing, and you by confusion at a discount. Launch a trading exploit when matching engines are in a hysteresis posture and your orders surf jitter nobody can fully audit. The file doesn't dramatize this. It lists it under opportunistic risks, like a grocery note that happens to include knives. What about the thing everyone fears but nobody writes plainly? Could a reset misfire? The machine pages hedge. Coherence loss, short, is their bet. Node slip, localized perturbation, is their warning. There's no catastrophic scaffold collapse bullet, because that would be theology, not engineering. Resonant systems prefer to reacquire if the medium supports them. Stars support them. The crisis isn't physics failing. It's coordination failing while physics changes tempo for a minute. Microstories make it real. A dispatcher in a mid-sized city watches CAD timestamps drift out of order for 5 minutes and reflow, calls IT, gets told it was NTP turbulence. A farmer in a valley that prides itself on early crops loses a week to a spring that doesn't quite bite. Blooms come on schedule, bees do not. A small set operator sees a wheel step pattern that matches no commanded input and writes environmental regularity suspected, because nobody lets them type carrier. Countermeasures in the fragment, red like a drummer's toolkit. Firmware hysteresis. Widen deadbands so loops don't lock to jitters. Local time buffers. Discipline to local ensembles during windows, blend back gently after. Plan blackouts as shields. Take non-critical load off thin sections, so a wobble has fewer tuners to excite. They aren't silver bullets. They're shock absorbers. You still feel the pothole. Your axle survives. There's a decision point that never made it to a press podium. Do we comply or buffer? Comply means align operations to the known beat, and let resets pass clean, trusting the lattice to hand back a tighter baseline. Buffer means assert independence hard, risk phase fights that make small systems brittle. One memo split the difference: backbone compliance, edge buffering. Translation: let clocks that feed clocks listen. Let humans who feel timing most get padding. This isn't a call to worship a machine. It's an admission that a furnace might also be a metronome. Soft fails waste minutes and money. Hard fails bruise regions. Most days, the lattice is a kindness shared now that lets rooms agree. On reset days, the kindness asks for accommodation. The crisis isn't that the sun falters. It's that we pretend timing is only a local problem until the hallway's echo changes. The 2026 Playbook: what they'll do, what we can do. By the time the 43 seconds landed, the choreography was already on paper. Government desks didn't need belief. They needed procedures. So they wrote a playbook that reads like weather ops for a sky that sometimes counts. First move: quiet firmware patches. Satellite control segments scheduled, routine upgrades, bracketed around the tolerance band. The notes avoided nouns with teeth. No talk of carriers, just loop stability enhancements, steering conservatism, rate limiters. Translation: add hysteresis, so timing loops don't overreact when the beat takes a breath. A handful of birds were flagged for maintenance windows that, if you overlaid the fragments' reset tolerance, sat right where you'd expect. Ground segments widened upload intervals, so clustered corrections looked like smooth drift. If you were watching, you saw less motion, not more. That's the point. Grid operators got a different dance. Frequency clamps tightened during the window. Governors nudged toward discipline over efficiency, under language like low disturbance interval tuning. Interties agreed on temporary deadbands, so cross-border power flows didn't amplify tiny angle wiggles into regional hunts. PMUs stayed hot. Analysts were told to log raw angles but report only smoothed aggregates until after-action reviews. If a wobble came, the clamps would absorb it. If stillness came, the grid would ride it without ringing. Finance dressed theirs as prudence. Matching engines at major exchanges tested volatility bands and circuit breakers on midnight shifts no one covered. Risk desks rehearsed microburst latency scenarios. What if timestamps smear for a minute? Then filed drills under disaster recovery. During the window, they set kinder breakers and widened bands, just enough to keep automated strategies from surfing jitter. Official reason: seasonal liquidity. Real reason: respect the beat without saying you respect it. Hospitals got guidance that felt like staffing memos. Sleep and psych triage got extra hands on predicted surge nights. YARs adjusted break patterns so more eyes were on monitors when wards sang. Anesthesiology huddles included a short note: expect slightly wider induction variability, prefer protocols with built-in buffers. None of it named the sun. All of it assumed a room that might lose its click track for a bar. Air and space snuck their precautions into maintenance schedules. Airlines padded block times by a whisper on targeted nights, then blamed congestion if anyone asked. Mission control teams prepositioned for safe mode cascades. Extra operators on consoles, pre-drafted scripts for wheel steps and panel heaters. So a hiccup in one bird didn't turn into a flinch across a fleet. If nothing happened, it looked like a training day. If something did, it looked like competence. None of this required a press conference. It required coordination in places built to swallow secrets. And behind those moves sat the argument nobody outside the compartment got to vote on: comply or buffer. The compromise held. Backbone systems, standards labs, primary time services, bulk grid governors would lean with the beat to let the reset pass clean. Edge systems, interfaces with humans, critical care, trading UIs, would wear shock absorbers. That's how you keep planes on time and people sane when a metronome you don't control coughs. Now for the part that belongs to us. Personal prep isn't doomsday shopping. It's smoothing your own loop. Analog backups matter more than you think. A battery quartz watch set from multiple sources, a paper list of critical contacts, maps that aren't an app. Local timekeeping is a hedge. If your phone's time server chases a smear, your watch doesn't care. Align key tasks away from the predicted dip evenings if you can. Long drives, hard deadlines, procedures that punish delay. If you can't, add padding and treat jitter like weather. Sleep hygiene sounds soft until monitors sing. During the window, tighten your routine. Darken your room, kill blue light early, anchor wake times. If your city sleeps in chorus for a night, you'll surf it better with a rhythm already in place. If it fragments, you'll have a protocol ready. Shorter naps, light exposure on waking, hydration, caffeine with intent, not panic. The point isn't control, it's resilience. Off-grid buffers help. A charged power bank, a small UPS on your router or CPAP, a flashlight where you can find it at 3 a.m. If grid frequency clamps by deficiency, you might see flickers. You don't need to know why to be okay. And if you're responsible for others, kids, elders, patients, write a simple plan on paper, so if clocks argue, your head doesn't have to. Here's an easy tell. If your tools give you a prefer local option for time, use it during the window. Let devices discipline to their own ensembles for a night, then blend back. That's what the fragment means by local time buffers. On the human side, think of it as keeping your own beat rather than chasing a room that might stutter. It's a small defiance that reduces friction. Ethics runs under all of this like a low note. Stability buys secrecy. Secrecy taxes trust. The people who sent quiet patches and set clamps chose calm over candor because panic breaks systems faster than resets do. But there's a middle path, informed resilience. You don't need lattice diagrams to act like a grown-up. You need a heads up that certain nights might feel gummy and a handful of habits that turn gum into grip. Whistleblowers argued for that middle. Tell nurses when wards tend to sing. Tell grid operators why their clamps land on those dates. Tell pilots what their bodies might do at 3 a.m., not with mysticism, with timing. We don't have to worship a machine to acknowledge a metronome. We can prep like we do for a storm, quietly, competently, together. So this is the ask. In the window, be gentler with your loops. Build small buffers. Anchor routines. If you run systems, choose hysteresis over heroics. If you run a life, choose margins over brinkmanship. And pay attention. The only power we have over a beat we didn't set is how we move to it. The agencies have their playbook. We get one too. It's smaller, human, and it works. The sealed paragraph. It took a year to peel the glue off one paragraph. The folder had been copied, redacted, re-redacted, and then printed so many times the paper smelled like a basement. The stamp said energy security. The margin notes said maintenance. The body was math and verbs. And then, under a blackout box that used to be ink and had become theater, the sentence finally breathed. Primary function, Biospheric Time-Rate Regulation. No metaphor. No caveats. Not possible, not candidate. A label, the way you'd label a valve. The room where we read it went quiet in that helpless way people get when a small sentence moves a wall they thought was part of the planet. If the lattice is real, and the carrier is real, this is the first line that stops pretending it's just a curiosity. Regulate the rate at which life measures time. Not the days. The feel of now as it threads through cells, clocks, and crowds. Under it sat a second line that didn't care about arguments we've had for a century. Secondary function. Information coherence for planetary cognition systems. They didn't mean Wi-Fi. They meant the ways minds link, markets, languages, networks, swarms of decisions that only behave when timing is shared. Cognition systems reads like a phrase you invent to avoid saying us. Get this, the next sentence was the only one that sounded like a human clearing a throat. Custodian, interface authority only, no control. We interface, we don't control. That's policy trying to outrun physics. Even if you can't steer the lattice, you can step with it or trip over it. Custodian says there's a desk with a phone that rings when the beat coughs. Authority says they get to call grid ops and exchanges. No control says they don't get to grab the sun, meaning doesn't arrive with a brass band. It creeps in through the edges of what you already know. We'd seen the tolerance tables. We'd seen reset, service interval, post-reset baseline may shift by 010. We'd followed SABER's staircase and watched wards sing. The sealed paragraph didn't add fireworks. It added motive. If the sun carries a narrow now that keeps biology and machines in tolerable sync, then resets aren't omens. They're upkeep. You don't have to like the word machine to accept regulator. Call it a star taught a new trick long ago. Call it an ancient accommodation written in plasma and patience. There's a line break that matters more than it looks. After we don't control, a short inventory appears, interfaces, not levers. Firmware hysteresis guidelines. Local ensemble discipline advisories. Scheduling memos that read like flight plans for nights when the hall goes still. It's not grand. It's the to-do list we've been following, without a noun to justify it. That's the real confession. The cover-up never tried to erase the beat from the people who had to dance. It tried to keep the rest of us from asking who wrote the music. What nobody in that room said out loud, because saying it makes enemies, is that this reframes authority. Telescopes lose primacy to timing desks. Space agencies share the front row with grid operators and standards labs. When maintenance becomes a civic event, the people who approve blackouts matter as much as the people who name sunspots. And ethics stops being abstract. If you regulate biospheric time rate, do you owe the biosphere notice? Do nurses deserve a memo that says wards may sing? Do pilots deserve a line that says your body may slip at 03:10Z, caffeine and protocol ready? Here's where the paragraph did something subtle and necessary. It killed the cartoon. The sun isn't a bolt-on machine in this file. It's a furnace with a resonant habit that's been harnessed, coaxed into reliability, not overwritten. Embedded in nature's fabric, showed up in a summary 2 pages later, like an apology to anyone who'd accuse the authors of fantasy. The regulator lives in the star the way a rhythm lives in a song. Take away the music, and there's no place for the beat to sit. Payoff doesn't mean prophecy. 2026 wasn't the end of anything. It was the latest service window printed in a hand that preferred error budgets to adjectives. We felt the pause, 43 seconds of gummy, a snap 2 nanoseconds cleaner, and then the room kept breathing. That's the point. Maintenance you can schedule is maintenance you can survive. The sealed paragraph isn't a threat. It's an owner's manual that refuses to call anyone an owner. The last marginalia in that section came from a pen I now recognize. Post window, pursue public testability without anthropogenic coupling. That's a bureaucratic way to say, make this falsifiable without letting human systems feed back into the measurement. The QSE crew stumbled into that mandate by accident. Timing labs did too. Whisper-level science that can live without a clearance stamp is how you move from rumor to civics. What changes after you read those lines? You stop treating timing as plumbing and start treating it as weather. You build buffers the way coastal towns build dunes. You plan staff the way hospitals plan for full moons, even if they're not supposed to. You admit that a civilization's cognition, its trades, votes, sirens, and stitches, benefits from a sky that hums a narrow now. And you argue, finally in daylight, about what to say and when. One more sentence, tucked under a block that used to be black. Public narrative, natural resonance management. It's cowardly and correct. Say natural, because the furnace is still the furnace. Say resonance, because engineers won't throw objects. Say management, because somebody has a calendar with windows circled in pencil. You don't need aliens to have governance. You need patience, instruments that shouldn't have existed in the 195s, and a culture that can handle the idea that the sun is both a star and a metronome. So here's the payoff we owe you after dragging you through memos, clocks, wards, and stones. The sealed paragraph doesn't hand us proof. It hands us posture. The people closest to the file treat the lattice as infrastructure inside nature. They don't worship it. They budget around it. They run drills. And on the best nights, when the carrier holds and the world clicks into place, they let the room enjoy how easy everything feels without telling you why your coffee tastes better. We can live with that as rumor. Or we can make it a practice. Small buffers, honest calendars, and a shared sentence we don't have to hide anymore. Primary function, Biospheric Time-Rate Regulation. Secondary, keep us thinking together without stepping on each other's toes. Custodianship, interface, don't steer. If that's the truth, it isn't doomsday. It's maintenance, and maintenance is a choice. If the sun hums our shared now, authority, timing, and trust need new rules, and maintenance becomes a civic ritual, not a secret. If you want the whistleblower-led breakdown of the silent firmware patches and grid buffers they've already deployed, subscribe now. Watch the next episode where we uncover the 195's attempt to copy the lattice, and how that imitation backfired on its makers. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the schedules they won't publish.